Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Michael Allen. Remember, if you're watching this before the election, I will be doing live 6-hour election night coverage at Decision USA 2020. So you want to go to Decision USA Online. That's Decision USA Online. One more time. Decision USA Online. And make sure you share that with everybody. Me and Seth Keshel, or Seth Keshel and I should say, will be doing the coverage. He's my data thrasher, as I call him. We're going to have great guests, everybody from Kerry Lake to Seb Gorka to novelist Brian Freeman, many, many more, Major General Mike Flynn. So join us. It's going to be a great night. And if you can kick in a few shekels, it isn't cheap. It's a very costly thing to put this on. So help us out with a small donation. We appreciate it. All right. We are completing a document written by Carl Schurz, Secretary of the Interior. Let me make sure I have that right. Yep. Under President Hayes, called Present Aspects of the Indian Problem. I read about half of it last time. It's a long document. So I'm picking up now. This is in the Patriots History Reader, and I'm picking up on page 200. Yep. And I am in the first full paragraph. To this end, it seems indispensable that agricultural work be principal occupation of the Indians, but we need not be troubled by any misgivings on this head. The reports of early explorers show that most of the Indian tribes, without having passed through the pastoral state, did cultivate the soil in a rough way and on a small scale when first seen by the white men, and that subsequently they continued that pursuit to a greater or lesser extent, even while they were driven from place to place. The promotion of agricultural work among them will therefore not only be a revival and development of the old practice. The progress they now make shows how naturally they take to it. And if the government, as it should, continues to furnish them with domestic animals, cattle raising in a small way may become not their principal business, but a proper and valuable addition to their agricultural work. Many Indians who, but a few years ago, did nothing but hunt and fight are now engaged in building houses for their families, and with some instruction and aid on the part of the government, they are doing reasonably well. Here and there, an Indian is found who shows striking ability as a trader. All these things are capable of large and rapid development. If pushed forward and guided with wisdom and energy, the significant part is that recognizing the change in their situation, Indian men will almost generally accept work as a necessity, while formerly all the drudgery almost generally was done by women. The civilized tribes in the Indian Territory and elsewhere have already proved their capacity for advancement in a greater measure. One of the most important agencies in the civilizing process, of course, is the education in schools. The first step was the establishment on the reservations of day schools for Indian children. The efforts made by the government in that direction may not always have been efficiently conducted, but it is also certain that in the nature of things, the result of that system could not be satisfactory. By the way, here in Phoenix, we had a very famous school called Phoenix Indian School. And in the annual parade we had down Central Avenue, Phoenix Indian School band in their full Indian regalia would march in that parade. The Indian, in order to be civilized, must not only learn how to read and write, but how to live. On most of the Indian reservations, he lives only among his own kind, expecting the teachers and the few white agency people. He may feel the necessity of changing his mode of life ever so strongly. He may hear of civilization ever so much, but as long as he has not with his own eyes seen civilization at work, it will remain to him only a vague, shadowy idea, a newfangled outlandish contrivance, the objects of which cannot be clearly appreciated by him in detail. Nothing speaks to this more than driving through an Indian reservation, as I do frequently, and seeing satellite dishes next to the houses. If the Indian is to become civilized, the most efficient method will be to permit him to see and watch civilization at work in his own atmosphere. In order to learn to live like the white man, He should see and observe how the white man lives in his own surroundings, what he is doing, what he is doing it for. Such considerations led the government under the last administration largely to increase the number of Indian pupils at the Normal School in Hampton, Virginia, and to establish an institution for the education of Indian children at Carlisle in Pennsylvania, very famous school, where the young Indians would no longer be under the influence of the Indian camp or village, but in immediate contact with the towns, farms, and factories of civilized people living and working in an atmosphere of civilization. So this is where today's critics of cultural imperialism come in, because they see this happening and they say, well, that's not right. You're forcibly changing their culture by trying to tell them that their culture is bad or wrong. To a degree, yeah. But really, also what you're trying to do is say, hey, there's another way if you want to take it. Look, here it is. And a fine balance needs to be maintained between those two elements. The results gained at these institutions are very striking. The native squalor of the Indian boys and girls rapidly gives way to neat appearance. A new intelligence lighting up their faces transforms their expression. Many of them show an astonishing eagerness to learn, quickness of perception, pride of accomplishment, and love for their teachers. True story, I'll never forget, as a boy at the Southern Baptist Church in Chandler, we went out one night to a mission visit to the Pima Indian Reservation affiliate Baptist church out there. And we're supposed to arrive at 7 for a 7:15 or a 7:30 meeting. I forget what it was. And half an hour after the meeting starts, not a person in the church. And finally, a couple of people come in and we go, what's going on? And I'm just telling, they go, Indian time. And we learned that Indian time is about an hour later than whatever they say. When the Indian pupils have received a sufficient course of schooling, they're sent back to their tribes to make themselves practically useful there and to serve in their turn as teachers and examples. Even most of the old fogey chiefs who have clung most tenaciously to their traditional customs very earnestly desire their children to receive that education for which they feel themselves too old. In one word, knowledge and skill are now in practical requisition among them, and the man who possesses those accomplishments is no longer ridiculed, but looked up to and envied. We see a great deal of this in inner cities where Black youths are told that the drug dealers are the guys to be looked up to, and you don't want to be one of these kids who studies all the time. It becomes embarrassing to be smart or to study, right? As a third thing necessary for the absorption of the Indian and the great body of American citizenship, I mentioned their individualization in the possession of property by their settlement in severalty among small farm tracts with a fee simple title. Now, this is a very good sentiment. The problem is that you're trying to introduce private property rights to peoples that have not had them in this respect for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not like the slow evolution of private property rights in Europe. When Indians are so settled and have become individual property owners, holding their farms by the same title as the law by which white men hold theirs, they will feel more readily inclined to part with such of their lands as they cannot themselves cultivate, and from which they can derive profit only if they sell them, either in lots or in bulk, for a fair equivalent in money or annuities. Well, that didn't work too well. Indians lost a lot of their land to white theft under that system. So they came up with a replacement and a reinstitution of the reservation system, but with a twist. They were allowed to put casinos and given tax abatements on such things as cigarettes. And you don't have to pay tax on cigarettes that you buy on Indian land. And many places, including here in Arizona, they began leasing some of the land to farmers. So if you want to take the lease back at any time, as soon as that lease is up, the farmer's off. He doesn't own the land. You don't need to sell it. You can lease it, and they're making good money leasing the land. But of course, the major revenue source are the casinos with legalized gambling and quite rightly, many of these casinos have to be staffed by X% of Indians themselves. I far prefer, I know we're getting away from the narrative, and we'll get back to it. We're still got a ways to go. It's a long piece, but I prefer the Mississippi Choctaw chief. Cannot remember his name. He's in the book though. Philip, can't remember. Anyway, he introduced building with federal subsidies a business park, but once they got the park built, they began putting in major corporations like Hallmark Cards and Ford Motor Company, which hired Indians to assemble the harnesses of Fords, and that they brought no incompetence and no sloth. You had to do a good job. You had to show up on time, couldn't be drunk, blah, blah, blah. And Philip Martin and the Choctaws in Mississippi ended up winning excellence awards from Ford for their good work. It can be done. I am not a party to tribal politics. I've never been in a tribal meeting, so I don't know what the resistance is to leasing far more utterly dead land. I mean, there's nothing there. I'm 100 yards from the Pima Reservation. I'm 100 yards from two big tracts of farmland that's leased, the big crop circles. And on the other side, except for the casino, there's nothing. It's just dead. It's tumbleweeds. So I don't know what their resistance is to doing more leasing. I guess you'd have to ask them. Anyway, back to this. This done, the Indians will occupy more ground than so many white people. The large reservations will gradually be open to general settlement and enterprise, and the Indians with their possessions will cease to stand in the way of, quote, development of the country, unquote. Again, this didn't work out. Difficulty which has provoked so many encroachments and conflicts will no longer exist when the Indians are individual owners of real property, and as individuals enjoy the protection of the laws, their tribal cohesion will necessarily relax, he means go away, and eventually disappear. They will have an advance in an immense step in the direction of the white man's way. Is this plan practicable in the respect that we not entirely without experience? Allotments of farm tracts to Indians and their settlement in severally have already been attempted under special laws or treaties with a few tribes, in some instances with success, in others, Indians, when they had acquired individual title to their land before they had learned to appreciate its value, were induced to dispose of it or were tricked out of it by unscrupulous white men who took advantage of their ignorance. So you can't give them the land and say you have full authority, it's your land, and then say, but oh, wait, you can't sell it to this guy. You're going to expose people to charlatans. They were thus impoverished again, and some of them fell back upon the government for support. This should be guarded against as much as it can be by a legal provision making the title to their farm tracts inalienable for a certain period, say 25 years, during which the Indians will have sufficient opportunity to acquire more provident habits, to become somewhat acquainted with the ways of the world, and to learn to take care of themselves. Question whether and how far Indians generally are prepared for so great a change in their habits and as their settlement in severalty involves is certainly a very important one. Appeals to the government from Indians of that class for allotment of farm tracts to the heads of family and for the white man's paper have been very frequent of late, and in many instances very urgent. It must be kept in mind that the settlement of the Indians in severalty is one of those things which the Indians and the government are not always permitted to choose their own time. The necessity of immediate action may now and then present itself suddenly. Take the case of the Utes. Living in a country where game was still comparatively abundant down to a recent time, they were less inclined than other wild tribes to recognize the necessity of a change in their mode of life. But the pressure of mining enterprise in the direction of the Ute Reservation was great. Fights and massacres occurred on the Ute Reservation, which are still fresh in our memory. Negotiations were open, and the Utes agreed to be settled in severalty among the lands designated for that purpose, and to cede to the United States the whole of their reservation, except some small tracts of agricultural and grazing lands, in consideration of certain ample equivalents and various forms. It is therefore of the utmost importance that the Indians, as well as the country generally, that a policy be adopted that will secure to them and their descendants a safe possession of such tracts of lands as they can cultivate, and a fair compensation for the rest, and that such a policy be proceeded before the protection of their present large possessions by the government becomes too precarious. That is to say, before conflicts are precipitated upon them, which the government is not always able to prevent, and by which they may be in danger of losing their lands, their compensation, and even their lives. At the same time, it would be undoubtedly better if they could carefully be prepared for such a change of conditions so that they might clearly appreciate all of its requirements and the consequences which are to follow. But those entrusted with the management of the Indian affairs must not forget that with regard to the Indian tribes and the reservations, at least, the matter is pressing that the government cannot control circumstances, but is rather apt to be controlled by them. And that it must not only devise the necessary preparations for the change in the condition of the Indians with forecast and wisdom, but must push them with greatest possible expedition and energy if untoward accidents are to be avoided. I'm aware I have not discussed here all of the points of importance connected with the Indian problem, such, for example, as the necessity of extending jurisdiction of the courts over Indian reservations, bringing the red men under the protection as well as the restraints of the law, and the question of how the service should be organized to secure the Indians' intelligent, honest, and humane management, etc. It has been my purpose merely to set forth those important points which, in the practical management of the Indian affairs, should steadily be kept in view. I will recapitulate them. The greatest danger hanging over the Indian race arises from the fact that with their large and valuable territorial possessions, which are lying waste, they stand in the way of what is commonly called the, quote, development of the country. 2, a rational Indian policy will make it the principal object to avert the danger from the red men by doing what will most be beneficial to them as well as to the whole people, namely, by harmonizing the habits, occupations, and interests of the Indians with that, quote, development of the country. 3, to accomplish this object, it is a pressing necessity to set the Indians to work to educate their youth of both sexes, to make them small proprietors of land with the right to individual ownership under the protection of the law, to induce them to make that part of their lands which they do not need for cultivation profitable to themselves in the only way possible by selling it at a just rate of compensation, thus opening it to general settlement and enterprise. This policy here outlined is apt to be looked upon with disfavor by 2 classes of people. On the one hand, those who think that, quote, the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and on the other hand, the class of philanthropists who in the treatment of the Indian question pay no regard to surrounding circumstances and suspect every policy contemplating a reduction of the Indian reservations as being a scheme of spoliation and robbery gotten up to by speculators and land grabbers. With the first class, it seems useless to reason. As to the second, they do not themselves believe, if they are sensible, that 25 years hence, millions of acres of valuable land will, in any part of the country, still be kept apart as Indian hunting grounds. The question is whether the Indians are to be exposed to the danger of hostile collisions and of being robbed of their lands in consequence, or whether they are to be induced by proper and fair means to sell that which, as long as they keep it, is an advantage to anybody, but which, as soon as they part with it for just compensation, there will be great advantage to themselves and thus their white neighbors alike. No true friend of the Indian will hesitate to choose the latter line of policy as one in entire accord with substantial justice, humanity, civilization, welfare of the red men, and the general interests of the country. Now, you notice one thing that he never even contemplates in this entire discussion. He keeps talking about these small farms, and once they have a small farm, then they're going to sell off the rest of their land. What if they expand? What if all of them become early John D. Rockefellers and start expanding their land to where you have Indian corporations that are big and you have big Indian ranches? I mean, it hasn't happened, but it could. And as we saw with Philip Martin, there's a different way to skin the cat. You can do it with industrial parks. See, he is so condescending that he doesn't view it possible that the Indians can ever get above a certain level of commerce or industry. Now, as we're going to see later, the Dawes plan to give away this land to individual Indians did not work. And eventually, we had to resort back to reservations with tribes actually in charge as the governing body, and with Indian law on Indian land. Obviously, it couldn't be in violation of the Constitution, but as I mentioned before, we used to drag race on Indian lands on an airstrip out there, and you'd see the Indian police lights coming, and if they caught you on Indian land, your car could be held forever or sold off. You'd lose your property there. So it's very touchy. There's no good solution. Whenever you have this clash of entirely radically different ways of lives and values, which is what we had, there's not going to be anything comfortable about it. There will be a lot of injustice on both sides, and the best solution is probably going to be the least worst solution, which is, I think, what we have today with the reservation system. I go back to my old mentor at Arizona State, one of my teachers, Robert Trennert, whose book was called Alternative to Extinction. And I think he was right. I think without the reservation system, Indian tribes would have become extinct. And it's too bad because they have a lot to offer, especially culturally, in terms of arts and artisanship. I think they're making a better adjustment now than they made 50 years ago. 50 years ago, all they had was oil. That's a lot. Now they've figured out they also have uranium. They have lithium. They have other deposits under the ground. And let me repeat, the United States is the only nation in the world, in history, ever, to give individuals, or in this case, tribes, the legal right not just to the land, but what is below it. So under any other system, they would have been cheated out of all that oil, uranium, copper, whatever else. All right, we'll continue back with Patriot's history itself next time. I'll see you later on election night. Follow me on Decision USA Online. If you have a few extra dollars, kick in and donate. A decision desk that we use to keep you updated minute by minute as to who's winning where. That costs money. So help us out, and I'll see you guys back here sometime later.